Imagine your friends come to you with an incredible offer. They tell you that you can become a vampire. They promise you that the experience is absolutely incredible, a level of existence you cannot even begin to fathom. They have all done it, they all love it, but they also tell you that there is absolutely no way to explain it to you until you actually make the leap and let them bite you. Do you do it? How do you even begin to rationally calculate a choice when you cannot possibly know what the outcome will feel like? Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are diving into one of the most fascinating debates in contemporary philosophy. We are looking at a book symposium on L.A. Paul's groundbreaking work, specifically focusing on her Persists of Transformative Experience. It is a paper that completely shakes up how we think about major life choices, and we are going to break it down like we are just a couple of philosophy professors chatting over coffee. So, to start us off, what exactly is Paul getting at when she talks about these massive, life-altering choices?
That vampire scenario is the perfect hook, because it perfectly captures what Paul calls a transformative experience. But to really understand her argument, we have to look at the strict definition she uses. A transformative experience for Paul must have two distinct components simultaneously. First, it has to be an epistemically transformative experience. This means it is an experience that provides you with a kind of knowledge that you can only possibly get by actually living through it. You cannot get it from reading books, you cannot get it from someone else telling you about it. It gives you brand new abilities to imagine, recognize, and model future experiences of that same kind. Think of the classic philosophical thought experiment of Mary the color scientist, who knows all the physical facts about color but has lived in a black and white room her whole life. When she walks outside and sees a red apple for the first time, that is an epistemically transformative experience. But Paul adds a second crucial requirement. It must also be a personally transformative experience. This means the experience fundamentally changes your core preferences, your deepest desires, or your very sense of self-identity. It alters what you value and who you take yourself to be. When you combine these two, the epistemic and the personal, you get what Paul describes as a first-person Kuhnian paradigm shift. Your entire framework for understanding yourself and the world is radically overthrown.
A Kuhnian paradigm shift for the soul, essentially. That makes a lot of sense. But why does this dual transformation cause such a massive headache for philosophers? Because, as you lay it out, it sounds like standard decision theory, the framework we usually use to figure out what we should do, just completely collapses here. If I am trying to make a rational choice, say, about changing careers or moving across the world, I normally weigh the pros and cons based on what I think I will get out of it. Why does Paul say we cannot do that here?
Exactly. The standard decision model completely breaks down. Let us think about how we normally make rational choices. Deliberative decision theory says we evaluate our options by using our imagination to project ourselves into different future scenarios. We try to figure out what those outcomes will be like, and we assign a subjective value to them. Subjective value is a key term here. It is the value of what it is like to live that experience. It is not just about raw pleasure or pain. It essentially includes the phenomenological value, but it can also encompass non-sensory things like beliefs, emotions, and desires. We figure out the subjective value, we weigh it, and we choose the option that maximizes our expected utility. But in a transformative experience, you hit a brick wall. Because the experience is epistemically transformative, you literally cannot know its subjective value beforehand. You cannot imagine it. And because it is personally transformative, you cannot even predict how your own preferences will change once you go through it. You are trying to evaluate the future for a version of yourself that you do not yet know, using a perspective you do not yet have. The foundational mechanism of standard decision-making, which relies on projecting subjective value, is entirely blocked.
Which brings us right back to the vampires. Paul uses that specific thought experiment, the vampire case, to really hammer this home, right? Because it highlights this impossible situation where you are stuck between who you are now and who you might become.
Yes, the vampire case is her ultimate thought experiment. You have this one-time, irreversible chance to become a vampire. All your vampire friends tell you it is amazing, but they also insist that you cannot understand what it is like without experiencing it. So, you face this profound epistemic barrier. You cannot rationally choose to become a vampire based on what you think it will be like, because you literally have no idea what it will be like. But simultaneously, you cannot rationally choose to avoid becoming a vampire, because you do not know what you would be missing out on. Your current human preferences are completely useless for evaluating the subjective value of a vampire's existence. You are paralyzed, rationally speaking.
But people might say, sure, that is a fun sci-fi thought experiment, but how often are we offered a bite from Dracula in real life? But Paul is not just playing philosophical games here. She maps this exact same logical structure onto very real, very common human decisions. The primary one she uses is the decision of whether or not to have a child.
Precisely. Having a child is the ultimate real-world transformative experience. The physical and emotional experiences of pregnancy, childbirth, and forming that unique embodied parental attachment are radically new. You cannot know what that specific subjective value is until you are in the thick of it, and it is deeply personally transformative. It often fundamentally rewires a person's core preferences, shifting their values entirely, maybe from deeply valuing independence to prioritizing a family unit. The critical problem for the decision maker is that the shift in preferences between the current self, who does not have a child, and the future self, who does, is epistemically inaccessible. The person you are right now simply cannot access the viewpoint of the person you will become after having a child. Therefore, trying to calculate the expected utility based on your current preferences is a fundamentally flawed project.
Okay, so that is Paul's setup, and it is a massive challenge to how we think about rationality. But this text we are looking at is a symposium, which means other heavyweights in philosophy get to take their swings at her argument. Let us bring in the first critic, Richard Pettigrew. He essentially says, hold on, standard decision theory isn't dead yet, we just need to fix the math. He proposes something called the redescription strategy, right? How does Pettigrew try to solve this epistemic black hole?
Pettigrew wants to rescue decision theory by using a clever workaround. He agrees we cannot know the subjective value from the inside, so he introduces the redescription strategy. His idea is that instead of assigning a specific utility value to an outcome we cannot understand, we replace that unknown utility with uncertainty about hypotheses regarding what that utility might be. Basically, instead of trying to imagine the subjective value yourself, you look at statistical evidence, you look at data. You see that, say, 70% of new parents report a high degree of fulfillment. You then use that external data to set your credence, your degree of belief about what your own future utility will be. You redescribe the problem from a subjective first-person guessing game into a third-person statistical calculation. By doing this, Pettigrew argues, you can plug the numbers back into the expected utility formula and make a perfectly rational decision without needing to know what the experience actually feels like from the inside.
That sounds incredibly pragmatic. Just look at the Yelp reviews for having a baby and go with the averages. But Paul absolutely rejects this, and her rebuttal is fascinating. She argues that adopting Pettigrew's strategy leads to a profound sense of alienation. In fact, she points out two distinct types of alienation that happen if we just follow the statistics. Let us unpack that. What is the first kind of alienation she warns about?
The first is epistemic alienation. Paul uses a brilliant example of a supercomputer, a HAL computer from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Imagine you have a HAL computer that knows everything about your biology, psychology, and the statistical outcomes of millions of people. HAL crunches the numbers and tells you definitively that you should have a child. If you follow Pettigrew's redescription strategy, you have to outsource your decision to HAL. You have to substitute your own inner evaluation, your own attempt to grasp what your life will be, with the machine's statistical report. Paul argues that making a deeply personal life choice based on a computer spreadsheet profoundly alienates you from your own epistemic agency. You are entirely distanced from the first-person perspective that is supposed to be the bedrock of an authentic life choice.
So you essentially become a stranger to your own decision-making process. But you mentioned a second type of alienation, a metaphysical one. This seems to hit even deeper, dealing with who we actually are across time. How does Paul use David Velleman's work to counter Pettigrew here?
This is where it gets really deep. Paul points out a metaphysical alienation regarding our future selves. When Pettigrew relies on statistics, he assumes that the future person who experiences the outcome is, in a meaningful sense, still you. But Paul brings in Velleman's standard of the identical self. Velleman argues that for a future self to truly be your future self, there must be a psychological continuity, an empathetic connection where you can project yourself into their shoes. But because the transformative experience fundamentally ruptures your preferences and perspective, the post-transformation self, let's call it C1, is psychologically disconnected from your pre-transformation self at time T1. From your current perspective, that future self is effectively a stranger. So if you use Pettigrew's model, you are not maximizing utility for your future self, you are maximizing utility for a replacement self that you have no empathetic connection to. You are metaphysically alienated from the very person you are making the choice for.
That is a devastating critique of relying purely on statistics for personal choices. So Pettigrew tries to fix the math, and Paul says that costs us our authenticity. But let us bring in the second critic, Elizabeth Barnes. Barnes takes a totally different approach. She wants to prove that we can rationally avoid these transformative experiences even without knowing what they feel like, and she bases this on something called character planning. She uses some pretty extreme pop culture examples to make her point, right?
She does. And it is a fantastic argument. Barnes focuses on cases where we rationally reject a transformation precisely because of our current values. She uses the character of Winston in George Orwell's 1984, facing the thought police, and Captain Picard from Star Trek facing assimilation by the Borg. In both cases, if they undergo the transformation, their preferences will radically change. Winston will genuinely love Big Brother. Picard will genuinely want to assimilate the galaxy. The post-transformation selves will be perfectly happy. But Barnes argues that Winston and Picard are completely rational in fighting tooth and nail to avoid these experiences. Why? Because of character planning. They are looking at the potential future where their core values are obliterated. And they are saying, based on my current preferences, I reject that outcome. They don't need to know the subjective value of loving Big Brother from the inside to know that their current self finds that outcome deeply abhorrent. Barnes extends this to people who are firmly child-free. If someone's core identity involves not wanting children, they can rationally avoid the transformative experience of childbirth based on their current character planning without needing to access the unknown subjective value of being a parent.
That seems incredibly intuitive. If I know a transformation will make me into someone my current self hates, I am justified in running away, regardless of how happy that future self might be. It feels like Barnes has found a real loophole in Paul's setup. How does Paul defend her thesis against this character planning argument? Because she has to differentiate having a child from being tortured by the thought police.
Exactly, she has to draw a very sharp line there. Paul responds by analyzing the nature of the change in Barnes's examples. Paul argues that the thought police and Borg assimilation involve something fundamentally different from normal life choices. They involve a loss of mental autonomy. Winston and Picard are being subjected to brainwashing and coercion. Paul argues that in these specific cases, objective moral value trumps subjective value. We rationally avoid the Borg not just because of our current preferences, but because losing our mental autonomy is an objective moral wrong. The future self's testimony is compromised because they are essentially brainwashed. But, Paul points out, having a child or choosing a new career does not involve a loss of mental autonomy. These are what she calls open field decisions. Once you clear away all the objective moral facts and practical constraints, you are left with a choice where the only tiebreaker is what you want your future subjective experience to be. And in those open field cases, the preference change is natural, not coercive. Therefore, you cannot treat the natural evolution of preferences in parenthood the same way you treat coercive brainwashing by the thought police. The epistemic block regarding the subjective value remains intact for the everyday transformative choices.
So Barnes's examples are too extreme. They involve a violation of rights, whereas Paul is interested in voluntary, authentic self-creation. Okay, that brings us to the final commentator in this symposium, John Campbell. Campbell attacks Paul on a completely different front. He looks at how Paul is defining imagination and authenticity. He accuses Paul of holding a very narrow, internalist view of the mind. Let us break down Campbell's critique. What does he mean by internalist versus de-re and effective imagination?
This is a really important critique about philosophy of mind. Campbell argues that Paul's entire framework assumes an internalist view of imagination. This means Paul treats imagination as merely simulating internal mental states, specifically qualia, like Mary seeing the raw feel of the color red. It is purely about what is happening inside the head. But Campbell says that true, authentic decision-making requires a much richer type of imagination. He argues for an externalist view, specifically de-re and effective imagination. De-re means the imagination is about the actual things in the external world. It is about your relationship with your environment, not just your inner feelings. Effective means it involves your emotional embeddedness in that world. For example, Campbell says, imagine trying to understand what it is like to live in poverty. An internalist just tries to simulate the raw feeling of hunger or anxiety. But true effective, de-re imagination means grasping the entire situation, the constraints, the social dynamics, the lack of opportunities in the actual environment. Campbell argues that when we make real decisions, we are projecting our whole selves into a future environment, not just guessing at isolated inner feelings. Therefore, he claims, Paul has artificially restricted what imagination can do in decision-making by focusing solely on internal sensory qualities.
That is a profound shift in perspective. If imagination is about embedding ourselves in a future context rather than just tasting a new flavor, maybe we have more cognitive tools than Paul gives us credit for. So how does Paul respond to this? Does she concede to Campbell, or does she stand her ground?
She does a bit of both. Paul makes a significant clarification here. She explicitly rejects the accusation that she is committed to an internalist view. She agrees with Campbell that subjective value is never just phenomenological in the narrow sense. It is the value of what it is like to live in that situation, which absolutely includes the external environment, our relationships, and our cognitive states. She fully embraces the idea that subjective value is expansive. However, and this is her crucial pushback, she insists that even if we adopt Campbell's rich, externalist, de re-imagination, the epistemic barrier of a transformative experience remains completely impassable.
Why is that? If our imagination is that rich, why can't it cross the gap?
Because, Paul argues, grasping that rich, external, affective reality still requires having the conceptual framework that is only unlocked by the experience itself. Even if you define the experience broadly to include the whole environment, if you have never had a child, you still lack the fundamental cognitive and emotional tools to properly represent what that specific embedded relationship with that specific environment is actually like from the first-person perspective. The transformation is so radical that it reshapes the very mechanism you use to grasp reality. So, she concedes the broader definition of subjective value, but holds firmly that the epistemic wall is just as high. You still cannot know what you are getting into.
Wow. So we have gone through this massive dialectical cascade. We saw standard decision theory collapse. We saw Pettigrew try to fix it with statistics, only to cause alienation. We saw Barnes try to use character planning, which Paul countered by distinguishing between normal choices and coercion. And finally, we saw Campbell expand imagination, which Paul accepted but still maintained her core epistemic roadblock. After this entire four-way symposium, where does this leave us? Does Paul conclude that we are just irrational creatures flailing in the dark? Did she just completely destroy decision theory?
This is the most critical takeaway. People often misread Paul as just being a total skeptic or claiming that all these choices are doomed to be irrational. But her actual conclusion is much more nuanced and intellectually honest. Her true conclusion is that this is a massive open question. She explicitly asks, in the context of transformative choices, how do we follow the norms of deliberative decision theory? How do we retain our authentic, informed decision-making while still being rational over time? And her exact, stated conclusion in the paper is this: I regret to say that I do not know the answer. She is not destroying rationality. She is pointing out a massive blind spot in our current models of rationality.
It is not just a philosopher's word game. She has identified a genuine paradox at the heart of human existence.
Exactly. It forces us to realize that living a human life involves stepping into the dark. It suggests a need for epistemic humility. Perhaps rationality isn't just about maximizing known utility. Perhaps it involves a different kind of courage, the courage to undertake a journey of discovery where we accept the responsibility of shaping ourselves even when we cannot see the final destination.
That is a beautiful place to leave it. A reminder that sometimes the most rational thing we can do is acknowledge the absolute limits of our own foresight. Thank you all for listening to this deep dive into L.A. Paul's Transformative Experience. We will see you next time.